We are gathered here to mourn the universe, for this what if is the stuff of nightmare. As I've been teasing for a long time now, HALO-ween would be a special story. I started this story back when the Linda timeline had just started, but enough of that. This is worst case scenario for the galaxy, an event that was so close to happening, how one tiny change would have doomed everything, the greatest threat the galaxy had ever seen, wielding the greatest weapon in the galaxy. We'll go over the events that lead up to this. This is Master Chief's encounters with the Flood had reached a boiling point during his expedition out of the control room of Halo. After facing down the horrors of the undead, unliving parasite, Cortana and he had planned to blow up Halo in order to stop both the Covenant and Guilty Spark from activating the ring, as well as the Flood from spreading. Sierra 117 and Cortana had ultimately decided to use Captain Key's implants in order to overload the reactor and blow up the Pillar of Autumn alongside Halo. Master Chief had taken a Banshee from the infected Truth and Reconciliation and crashed it on the side of the Pillar of Autumn. This is where the worst case scenario begins. While Chief clears the hallways of the Pillar of Autumn on his way to the engine room, he stumbles into the control room, and as he soon learned, was a big mistake. It wasn't too bad at first, or didn't seem to be, as he destroyed both of the Sentinels and went to work on the Flood, but every time he put one form down, it seemed as if two more arrived to take its place, soon forcing him onto the defensive. He retreated into the antechamber adjacent to the control room. The human had little choice but to place his back against a locked hatch. The larger forms came in 2s and 3s, while the infection forms came in swarms. Some of the assaults seemed to be random, but many appeared to be coordinated as 1, 2, or the combat forms would hurl themselves forward, die under the assault weapon's thundering fire, and fall just as the Spartan ran out of ammo, and more carrier forms waddled into the fray. He slung his AR, drew the shotgun, briefly hoping there would be a lull during which to reload, and opened fire on the bloated monstrosities before the force exerted by their exploding bodies could do him harm. Then, with newly spawned infection forms flying in every direction, it was cleanup time, followed by a desperate effort to reload both weapons before the next wave of creatures attempted to roll over him. He dropped into a pattern of fire and movement. He made his way through the ship, closer to the engineering spaces, pausing only to pour fire into the knots of targets of opportunity. Then he quickly disengaged, reloaded, and ran farther into the ship. The noise generated by his own weapons hammered at the Master Chief's ear. The thick, gagging odor of flood blood clogged his throat, and his mind eventually grew numb from all the killing. After dispatching a Covenant team, he crouched behind a support strut and fed rounds into the shotgun. Without warning, a combat form leaped into his helmet. His shield dropped away from the force of the blow, which allowed an infection form to land on his visor. Even as he staggered under the impact and pawed at the form's slick body, a penetrator punched its way through his neck seal, located his bare skin, and sliced it open. The Spartan gave a cry of pain, felt the tentacle slide down toward his spine, and knew it was over. He knew what it meant to become infected. The Spartan could not reach the infector, but he could turn his weapon on himself. If the Flood got a hold of him, nothing else would matter. Every conflict he suffered through, and all the soldiers that he'd watched die on this ring, on Reach, Sigma Octanus, and the many countless colonies he'd seen burnt to ash would be a drop in the bucket compared to what the Flood would soon produce. He could only hope the Covenant would defeat the Flood, and the flying nuisance that was Guilty Spark would deny them the ability to fire the ring. Just as the Master Chief turned his shotgun on himself, he felt a crackle of electricity course through his body. An unimaginable pain rendered him immobile. He instantly knew what it was. This was Cortana's gamble to stop him from killing himself and to stop the infection form from entering his spine. All his muscles contracted at once, snapping the shotgun in half, but also popping the Flood form on his bare skin like a pus-filled balloon. He could hear inside his mind and helmet Cortana asking him,
"Are you okay?"
He wanted to thank her, not for saving his life, but for trying. While he could survive and withstand the pain of this massive shock, it had been a miscalculation. His muscular physique contracting had snapped the shotgun in half like a twig and rendered him immobile momentarily. Now, defenseless and surrounded, he tried to move. He begged his arms to catch up with his mind and reach for his holstered assault rifle, but it was too late. The Flood forms had been fast, far faster than they had been. They were now acting with intelligence. They saw their one chance and took it. As the combat form that had thrown him, the wrench jumped on him, forcing him onto the ground. 6, 7, 8 more Flood forms sprinted down the corridors to hold him down. By the time his body could move, he was tangling with half a dozen combat forms, without a weapon, and pinned to the floor. The Master Chief knew this truly was the end.
Cortana, activate fusion genera.
He was cut off. as his helmet was forcibly removed and unsealed by a combination of combat forms and a carrier wobbling up over him. Every time he wrestled control back into one limb by punching a combat form or kicking an infected marine, 3 more would jump on said limb. He tried headbutting the creatures, but he felt the despair of futility. The last things his eyes would see were a pair of skinny legs supporting a massive body wobbling toward him. The creature had once been a jackal, but now it was his executioner. It dropped on its knees as its mouth began to open wide, unhinging its vestigial bird-like jaw to drool down a green and orange glowing ooze down onto John. He tried to close his eyes, his mouth, and hold his breath, but the creatures wouldn't allow him even that mercy. A pair of infection forms struck out at his lips and dug into his jaw. The razor-sharp tendrils sliced open his lips, gums, and eyelids. As the ooze poured into his face, he felt it infecting his bloodstream, drowning out his vision, dulling out his hearing, and finally the pain of a dozen cuts as infection forms crawled into his suit and made their way inside his body. Even now, he could feel his body attempting to fight back, but at this point, he was a spectator within his own body. He felt the mass of bodies being tossed around and slamming around him. They had given up in their efforts to hold him down. They knew he was infected and would succumb to them. He couldn't see and was losing the ability to command his body by the second, but attempted to reload the assault rifle near his legs. Blind and with his senses decaying, he'd managed to attain and reload his assault rifle. His final sliver of hope died when he lost control of his body entirely. The weapon he had been holding a second ago was tossed away, and he had again collapsed to the floor. John, on his knees, head cranked backwards, felt a presence inside his head similar to Cortana. Similar, but so much more powerful. Its mere presence in his mind was a cascade of pressure, like a heat wave from an active volcano melting his thoughts. He heard a voice.
Corpses shift and offer room. We exist together now. 2 corpses in one grave.
A single Covenant ship exited slipspace above the dying world the humans had called Reach. The ship had failed to answer any communications hailing from the fleet that still remained around the dead world. None of the ships in orbit could have missed the giant hole the ship tore in the fabric of reality when exciting slipspace. The ship had seen better days and was clearly damaged beyond repair. Every Covenant vessel within range of its crash site had tried to lend a hand. Not because of honor or a sense of duty, it was quite the opposite. Whatever the ship had gone through made it a shame to come back like this instead of the crew going down with it. The ship masters that surrounded the vessel could only see a thick sludge of green and brown mist coming out of the crashed remains of the vessel known as Ascendant Justice. They were all interested in whatever might have occurred at the holy site this ship had reportedly been at. There wasn't a single ship in the Covenant that hadn't heard about the discovery of one of the sacred rings. The return of Ascendant Justice in this sorry state was a warning for them all. Either be worthy of the great journey or die. The broken ship had crashed along a glassy plateau where one of the biggest battles of the entire war had happened, with thousands of bodies dead and decomposing. Some as fresh as days old, others nearly a month. Both sides had suffered incalculable losses, and even now the Covenant struggled to get the bodies of their commanders from these massive graveyards. Some of the pesky vermin yet lived and came out during the day to enact more Covenant loses when possible. The Covenant had even seemingly reported demons in droves, but even they were weakened by the constant wave of attackers and non-stop barrages on their cave-in dwellings. Zorahu Vaktimi temporarily commanded the largest fleet on this side of the planet. With his 6 ships, he commanded the second biggest fleet around the planet, now that the battle was all but over. His only rival was a Jiralhanai fleet master with command of 14 ships. His forces were scattered around the entire planet, however. Vaktime was convinced if the brutes tried to take this human world before proper artifact retrievals were implemented, he could defeat the mindless brute fleet before they gathered enough to pose a threat. He had been so focused on the threat of the Jiralhanai that when a Sangheli ship from the Holy Relics site arrived, he had immediately believed it was on his side, or here to retrieve the precious artifacts dormant still on the planet. But with no response from the crashed vessel, he had sent in several squads to check in on the crew. None of them had so much as reported back, and all signs of life had ceased. The shipmaster grew tired of waiting for the incompetence of his men to search the remains of the Ascendant Justice. He decided to take a party down to the surface himself. Vaktimi adorned himself with bright golden armor with energy shields many times stronger than those of a regular warrior. His phantom was equipped with nothing less than hardened warriors, victors of many battles, both on this planet and beyond. a dozen elites unloaded from the Phantom through the gravity well that sunk them down onto the ground around the ship. The first thing he noticed was the hollowed-out ground under his feet. The mushing of his feet was as unsettling as it was unexpected. He had imagined the surface to be hot and tempered from the fires raging across the planet, but instead, his feet sunk in with each step. The terrain was nothing like he'd ever seen before. It was porous and lacked consistency in density. As the elites approached the downed light cruiser, the wafting smell of decay invaded their olfactory senses. Vakhtimi's thoughts went to the stench of rotting human flesh, but this smell was somehow worse. All his senses were becoming dull and losing their sharpness from the sheer smell or death. He was no longer curious about what had happened to the crew of the Ascendant Justice. This was a matter of honor and glory now. Whatever lied ahead was dangerous and worthy of a strong warrior. Vakhtimi and his dozen elites all froze at the sight ahead. From the shadows of the opened crater on the hull of the Ascendant Justice, a figure emerged. They had all seen the vids and heard the tales. The demons would slaughter entire battalions of lower-ranked warriors, and if given an inch, they would do the same to more powerful and experienced warriors. They first saw a boot emerge and close in, followed by a tentacle-like appendage that cut through the air like a whip. In an instant, the elite closest to Vakhtimi dropped. 2 of his mandibles missing, snapped clean off. They had been cut in a flash of speed. All 13 elites activated their energy swords and began a sprint forward. Even the half-jawed elite had picked himself up quickly enough to join his brothers in battle. They all ran at the would-be demon, feeling pity that only one of them would get the glory for the kill. They had put all their efforts into going forward, that it had become impossible to turn around when they saw what came next. The demon took a step forward to reveal his shape. Fear couldn't aptly describe what was coursing through all their minds. The demon's screech ruptured their eardrums and stunned them to their core. Its pale, ugly skin had fused to its combat gear. Bulging sprawls struck out from the open and exposed crevices of the demon's armor, shapeless masses serving as extra limbs. An erupting, oozing pus drenched the creature. Its scream had woken a horde of death hiding in the shadows behind it. Countless new forms emerged, launching themselves at the elites. The lucky ones were those that were immediately killed. Surely there was less glory in dying without harming your opponent. But Vakhtimi lived long enough to see his forces be immensely overwhelmed and broken in ways he could never have imagined. Every one of his most trusted Sangheli would fall and take shape again, into a more grotesque and disgusting abomination. It was only clear to him in his final moments that the creatures had left him for last. It hadn't been his skill as a warrior that kept him alive the longest. It had been the creature's intent to make him soak in fear and preserve his mind for the information he knew. The brute fleet still on reach was parading around their victory, gloating in their conquest when they received even better news. A Jackal engineer on board the sturdy Hilt, a Jiralhanai heavy cruiser, had reported a transmission from a downed elite ship. The brutes on board had broken out into laughter. The burnt human world had managed to take down another one of the Sangheli light cruisers on the far side of the planet, and the elites had gone to investigate the crash site, or so they believed. The brute fleet had begun to intercept messages and distress signals amongst the elites, declaring the demon was decimating their forces, and what had been the loss of a single crashed light cruiser had soon turned into half a continent of missing Covenant troops. The mayhem had spread beyond just one ship, though. From orbit, the brutes witnessed something they would have never expected. The elite ships had turned on one another, and where there was once 6, there was now 1. The ship slipped and smoked. It reassembled a bruised and battered fish, with its tear-like overbulk shapen downward. The vessel had sent out hundreds of distress signals asking the brutes for help, and while the crew of the brute ships laughed, the shipmaster knew better. Elites would not beg, or even ask for help. It went against their honor. Whatever this demon had done to them had broken them. The mighty Bruta, shipmaster, thus ended up making a decision purely out of arrogance. Believing the Brutes could outgo and surpass the Elites, he prepared to board the Covenant Sangheli vessel, still on fire. The crew on his bridge had informed him the ship was disabled, however. The slipspace engine had been dismantled, and the reactor had been grievously damaged. In fact, a single plasma torpedo would probably do in the ship altogether. The brute thoughtfully considered for a moment blowing up the ship and pretending it was the last of the human vestige's doings, but knew if the hierarchs found out, he would not receive any mercy, at least not from regret, and ironically, mercy. The communications commander had confirmed one thing though, a human signal on board the Covenant ship. The brute wondered in puzzlement what it meant for a single human signal on board meant, but that was clarified when they listened in to one of the lost SOS signals. The elites claimed the demon and his forces had ambushed Fleet Master Vactimi on the ground and somehow hijacked his transport, and a lot more demons had spread out through the small fleet. Some of the parts in the message were muffled from battle sounds and fighting, and made the brute shipmaster lose his patience. Instead of hearing out the rest of the hailing signal, he made up his mind. They had been hunting down the demon survivors on the surface and underground caves of the planet, but had not seen them in days. Perhaps they had snuck across the planet and were trying to escape off-world by taking Covenant ships. The more he thought about it, the more he rationalized the truth into his head. The demons must have beaten the elites and be on board that vessel making repairs to escape. Brute Shipmaster Roguk had made up his mind. The Brute and a few of his forces prepared infiltration tubes and boarded attack phantoms. Their intention was to make a strong landing inside the last Sangheli ship, and the Brute would take on the demon himself to earn the glory of killing him with his bare hands. The shipmaster and his forces realized the gravity of their mistake as soon as they landed. The insides of the ship were covered in a light brown organic and pulsating fleshy substance. Signs of a heavy battle were evident, but there were no corpses. All that awaited them was a thick cloud of smoke and a disturbing smell. The fleshy textures of the walls reminded them of the insides of a mawing beast back on Doisak. It was as if they had been eaten whole and were in the process of being digested. How could their underdeveloped brains imagine the truth of what they were walking into? Every step they took further down the halls of the vessel exponentially exposed them to further danger. One of the grunts being forced up front ahead of the pack yelped and went dead silent. It had stopped moving. While one of the brutes started making its way toward the grunt, it was immediately snatched up into the air. All members of the party opened fire at where the brute had been pulled into, but the ape-like creature was gone, vanished into thin air, and no longer part of their reality. In the sudden distraction, they had missed the 100 or so small pod-shaped creatures that ambushed them from within the walls. The avian creatures were the first to go. The flood infectors easily wrapped their spiky tendrils around the jackal's thin and emaciated limbs. The infection creatures struggled very little in overcoming their attempts to claw them off. Next were the ungoi. Their stubby and short paws were strong enough to crush the flood infection forms, and their leathery skin kept them safe from the vast majority of cuts from the creatures. But they were only so strong. They too were quickly overwhelmed. It had finally come to the Jiralhani survivors when combat forms surrounded them. The hatred stemming from a 100-year-old rivalry for the elites was gone momentarily. The brutes could see where the elites ended and the infection began, but that didn't stop them from striking with their hammers. Ill-befitted swings, striking down the advancing infection. Though surrounded, their ferocity and strength continued to prove their power. The brutes had slowly but meticulously pushed back the way they had come from, even as walls shifted and blocked their paths. They were content enough with making a few walls of their own. The brute fleet master had had enough. Reporting this infection to high charity would elevate him, and he would be rewarded for his service to their covenant. He still hadn't figured out where the human signal of the demon had come from, however. Was this infection the humans' final ultimate weapon after they had destroyed their world? There was questions he still didn't have answers to, but the situation was on the verge of turning on them. Even though they had managed to make it back to their boarding phantoms, the surviving brutes were clearly exhausted. They had to get out of there and burn the vessel to cinders. He thought he understood just what had happened to elites, but the missing critical piece showed itself. The shimmer of a gold-tinted visor caught his eye. It was the demon. He'd seen one on Harvest decades before and managed to live. After it had killed dozens of Covenant combatants without slowing down, it had left the brute with fear. But if that back then had been a demon, this thing in front of him was the Underdweller itself. This was a demon amongst demons. The human armor fused with this new infection made the leader of the brute's thick fur coating stand on its ends. He wasn't about to lose to a human, not even a demon. The brute took off in a sprint towards the grotesque creature with markings on its chest that read out 117. The gravity hammer in his hands dragged along the floor, cutting through the squishy biomass on the outer layer of the thick purple reams. 2 meters away from its prey, the brute adjusted his weight all into the swing of his hammer. His physical strength multiplied 100-fold by the combination of his speed, gravity hammer, and reach. It had been a direct hit, sending the little demon flying back through the hatch door that led into the bay with the awaiting phantom. All brutes paused as their leader breathed in heavily. His ragged and exhausted breath was loud and thunderous. The brute let out a chuckle. Poor little demon. His laugh caught in his throat as an infected mass wrapped itself around it. Before he could bring up his gravity hammer, a few shots from a human weapon embedded themselves into his hand, followed by another tentacle holding down his hand. Seemingly in a flash, more and more of these appendages reached out at him and his brute companions. Some, like himself, still had the strength to rip them apart and free themselves, but that was not enough. Not nearly. The demon had taken a hit that could break open the hull of a starship, but it was back up again, as if nothing had happened. Its movements not as refined as the ones he had seen from the demons before, but clearly more savage and powerful. The green and yellow demon took down his entire pack in a matter of seconds. It had overpowered them with its bare hands and shoved its infected bits down their throats, spines, and wrapped itself around them, breathing into them a new kind of life. A life empowered by death. As the brutes in his pack screamed, some begging for death, bones snapping and reshaping, faces contorting, fangs sharpening to a degree he couldn't believe, clad turning into protruding spikes that could cut down any foe dumb enough to get within striking range. A true transformation that left his brood unrecognizable even to him. The Fleet Master brute had been struggling to keep himself uninfected, but his efforts had failed as he began to feel his mind full and grow complacent with the pain of his broken bones, his left eye popping out of its socket and dragging down near his chin, still able to see but unable to avoid watching the horrors around him. The brute knew it was over. He let go of the grip around the hilt of his hammer and dropped to his knees.
Sierra 117, John Sierra 005, James Sierra 006, Jai.
Chief, fight it.
Sierra 034 Samuel, Sierra 037 Randall, Sierra 039 Isaac.
I'm not strong enough, but you are, John.
Sierra 120 Michael, Sierra 122 Joseph.
Damn it, Chief, he has control of me. And now he's got elite and brute ships. The whole galaxy will be in danger soon. No, not them. Not them too, please, I'm begging you. He is using your memories and my systems to transmit out that signal, Chief. If they're still alive anywhere on Reach, they'll be walking into a trap.
Sierra 104 Fred, Sierra 111 Adriana, 117 John, 117 John.
Please, Chief, please.
Spartan 093, Grace ran back into the cave they had been hiding in for the last 3 weeks. Her heavy boots weren't muffled this time though. She ran as fast as she could to report back to Fred and Admiral Whitcomb. Her breath was caught in the helmet. Heavy sounds of panting came through the open mic. It was rare to hear a Spartan having to catch their breath after running. That told Fred more than enough about the situation. It was more urgent that words alone would convey.
It's the Chief. He's back. He's here and he made quite a mess out of the Covenant.
You've made contact with the Pillar of Autumn?
No, sir. It's gotta be the Chief. He's broadcasting a signal, but it's on an open channel.
How can you be sure it's him?
Is it our signal?
Yes.
And you say he made a mess of the Covenant?
One Covenant cruiser crashed over the northern Vieri territory, then 5 more. Another 14 came around from the far side of the planet, and 2 of them went down. It all happened very fast.
That's definitely him. Hail him back with our location.
Delay that order. I'm still not convinced.
Sir, with all due respect, he's the only one who could bring down the Covenant on that scale and know our signal.
Request a meet-up site. I don't want this location further compromised if someone is listening in.
On it, sir.
It took nearly 2 hours to get set up and move out. To a Spartan, this was more than ample time, but the survivors of the battle that transpired on Reach weren't just Spartans. Even so, all Spartan survivors had been through their share of hell. Broken bones, sprains, burns, and cuts. But low ammunition was the biggest of their concerns. The Master Chief had responded with a text-only message with coordinates to where they would meet him. Chief was a man of few words, and this didn't surprise anyone. The Spartans truly believed he was back, and had taken all the Coveys down. Their first struggle had been to escort the survivors of Castle Base, such as Halsey and Admiral Whitcomb, through the burnt wasteland that was now Reach. They had struggled through the superheated terrain, but had found no combat. The Covenant didn't leave vehicles behind when they burnt out worlds, but they hadn't even run into a warthog of mongoose either. While at first they didn't think much of it, the Spartans quickly noticed it. What unnerved them most was, however, there were no bodies in sight. Not a marine, not a grunt, not even a dog. Nothing. They had seen the signs of 100 battles, but no bodies. The Spartans were all on their toes. Their hair stood on end. They were prepared for anything, at any moment, and the closer they came to the coordinates, the worse the feeling in the pit of their stomach got. Their situation had reached a breaking point when the terrain changed. 2 hours of walking on superheated glass had changed into an orange and green marshy land. The Spartan leading the party, Fred 104, stopped in his tracks, refusing to step on the terrain he had never seen. The Spartans had fought on hundreds of worlds. Surely there were fauna types they hadn't seen, but not on Reach. Reach was their home. In all UNSC worlds, there was nothing like this, much less Reach. They knew it. Whitcomb knew it. Halsey knew it. She postulated this was some sort of life form the Covenant had brought in. The color and stench hinted at it being a decaying substance. Anything it had touched had clearly died. All of them refused to go on any further. With their coordinates being straight ahead to get to the chief, it was a tough spot to be in. They had left the safety of their caves for the promise of safety with John, but the obstacle in front of them seemed to permeate the entire valley. They would not step on the mass unless they had no choice. They did not dare, until a single voice spoke out. Linda's voice was heard through all their communications. She claimed to have eyes on the Master Chief. He was coming from quite a distance away. A slow pace, a wobbling strut she hadn't seen from him even after tearing his Achilles tendon. "He's hurt," she yelled out, but a confirmation of it being him was all they needed to step into the orange sickly goo. The closer they all got, the clearer the image became. He was hiding something. A dark brown cloak covered him from head to toe, all but chunks of his boots and visor. He was clearly battle damaged. That was no surprise. They could only imagine what he'd been through, but seeing it was different. They thought he was the best and could not lose, and being here for them was proof of that. Except the closer he got. The stranger, he looked. The Spartans all had vision that surpassed anything any other human could ever hope to possess. His wobble had disappeared now that they were all surrounded by the gelatinous terrain. One by one, they had all slowed down, and their optimism had turned into caution. Those who hadn't soon became worried as a dozen Covenant cruisers rose over the horizon. Bright blue balls of plasma uplifted over the plateau and landed around them. This had all been an ambush, the most obvious of all, but they had fallen for it because of him. It was all for him, their hero, their idol, their brother. From the ground, shapeless masses rose to slow them down. Others rained down from the cruisers. Some looked like deformed versions of the enemies they'd been fighting for 3 decades, and others were clearly once Marines. But all of them had one thing in common: hostile, demented forms. Well, not all of them, as forms made entirely of this cancerous mass began dropping in on them. One such form looked like a walking tank. They imagined that's how the Covenant viewed them, amongst regular humans. Spartans were walking wraith tanks too. Whatever few survivors there had been to escort Admiral Whitcomb and Halsey on Castle Base had lived just long enough to succumb to this sickness there. The air was clearly filled with the sickly ooze, and they didn't stand a chance without the use of Mjolnir or respirators. Those who had the gear necessary to avoid breathing in the spores of death weren't so lucky either. The infection would get to them one way or another, as the ones a meter in diameter burrowed themselves into the defenseless Marines and hijacked their bodies one by one. It was clear to them all what had happened now, but they didn't want to believe it. The Master Chief, or whatever was wearing that armor now, had been lost in a sea of those creatures, but they knew he was still there. This had to have happened to him, but the thought was too much for them to bear. The first Spartan to go down was James, one-armed and unable to react in time as a green figure rushed into him with the speed of Kelly and the precision of Linda. James's helmet cracked open from the blunt force. The fake 117 creature, on top of him, blinded him with rage, but the creature was too strong even for his Mjolnir. He was pinned down from a deformed arm, spewing a black ominous sludge that dropped into the open contacts on his helmet. Unable to move away, a small tentacle unlatched itself from the underneath of the ribcage, below the chest plate, sporting the numbers 117. The tentacle quickly crawled and dipped into James's eye socket, thinning out until it reached the nerves connected to the brain. He felt a burst of pressure in his cranium as the creature violated his insides by tugging at the nerves, connecting his brain to his spinal column. The sloshing around inside his head was a pain he could have never imagined. It was all over when the appendage inside him wrapped completely around his medulla oblongata. As fast as it had started, it was over. The infected Master Chief pounced from one victim to the next. He quickly rushed to Grace, and although she managed to dodge the initial strike from the foul beast, the second took hold of her. This creature was stronger and faster than John had ever been, something Grace hadn't considered. She managed to hit it with the butt of her battle rifle, expecting to knock him back with how much force she put behind the strike, but found no quarter given. The infected Spartan arched out a boot and kicked her down, knocking the wind out from her lungs. The pain she felt in her chest was as if a Covenant ghost had hit her at full speed. She struggled back to her feet, but by then, 2 of the hulking beasts were atop her, pinning her back down as one of the smaller ones removed her helmet and crawled inside her armor to slice open her skin and reach for her spinal cord. Fred could see his Spartans falling one by one, but couldn't help it. Whitcomb saw the futility in the situation. The Admiral had stopped firing. He looked over the gray and silver M6 pistol in his hand and turned it to Halsey.
Spartans, this cannot get back to Earth. Stop him by any means necessary.
The Admiral steadied his shaking arm and squeezed the trigger. Halsey's body dropped with a thinning, soundless numb, followed immediately by Whitcomb. The Spartans alive couldn't bear to look at their two failures on the ground before them, the closest thing they had to a mother for 3 decades, an admiral they were supposed to give their own lives to protect. More and more Spartans had dropped, and with each one that fell to the clutches of the demon, more rose. The last remaining of the Spartan twos huddled up, putting down each target that approached them. The counters on their weapons rapidly approached 0, with each bullet fired. Even so, those who remained were the best, the hardest to kill. But the infected knew that. They knew their weaknesses and strengths as well as they had when they were part of the living. The infection was getting smarter by the minute, and it was noticeably more so when the bodies of Dr. Halsey and Admiral Whitcomb joined the ooze on the floor. It developed perfectly laid out plans to counter each of the remaining Spartans. To trap Linda, they sent out a countless number of targets. Her marksmanship would mean nothing if she ran out of ammunition. After which, she was overwhelmed by sheer numbers and force. Kelly's demise came by way of being surrounded. Her speed wouldn't outpace them if she was entirely subjected to 6 infected Spartans. They had blocked off her every move and corralled her. Unable to freely move about, the infected Spartans neared down on her simultaneously to take her down. And finally, the last Spartan standing, in what would become a dead world in every sense of the word, a death that glassing a planet could never achieve. Sierra 104 finished loading in his final magazine into an old DMR. He slumped down and looked at the field ahead of him. Hundreds of infectors skidded around toward him, popping each with a singular bullet. Behind them, a track of infected elites, brutes, and marines rushed by. When he was out of ammo, his knives were his final defense, cutting through fleshy masses, which would have once brought down his opponents. In a single flick of his wrist, there were no longer vital points for the undead creatures. He'd expected as much, but there was nothing he could do. One by one, the monsters took a toll on him, slashing away at his joints, striking him with blunt force, all until each of his limbs was either cut or tied down. One way or another, he was immobilized, with nothing to do but bear witness to the end of all things. A figure sporting the 117 on its chest crept closer, slowly, knowing it had won. Fred stood face to face with the monster that puppeteers his brother's body, knowing everything was lost. Reach was lost. Humanity was lost. Even the Covenant was lost. This thing was loose on all of them now. The entire galaxy was lost. A giant beast with a snaking, coiling body emerged from behind the Master Chief. It removed John's helmet with one of its hundreds of tentacles. The disfigured creature that stood in front of Fred was no longer the Master Chief. It was death itself. 2 voices spoke from within the carcass.
I